If you're a millennial, you were brought up with the likes of Harry Potter, the Sanderson sisters. You were watching movies like The Craft and absolutely loving every minute of it. And you might not have been aware of the social unrest that was happening at that time when you were literally like 10 and 11 years old. But there was public outrage when Harry Potter became so massive. A lot of conservative Christians were really concerned that their children were reading all about magic and witches. So where does this fear really come from? And how did the idea of magic and witchcraft even really take root? Well, today we are taking a deep dive into the dark and twisted history of witches. From ancient pagan practices in Europe to the witch hunts that spread fear across continents, we'll follow the trail that led to one of the most infamous events in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. We're also going to dive into paganism, the practice of Wiccan, and even more. So this is going to be a very fun episode. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh Erin. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post 2 or 3 videos on one of these topics every single week, so if you like this sort of thing too, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. And I got this when I went to visit Salem a couple years ago. I wear it every season. I love pretending I am magic and I'm a witch, and I just wish I really was. I'd be a good witch, a really good witch. Anyways, guys, we're going to be here for a little bit, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now, before the term witch became synonymous with fear and persecution, practices that we now associate with witchcraft were often part of daily life in ancient Europe. Long before Christianity spread across the continent, paganism thrived in many regions. Pagans revered the natural world, believing in a pantheon of gods and goddesses and practicing rituals to try to connect them to the earth and to the seasons. In pagan traditions, magic wasn't something feared, but a fantastic tool for healing and spiritual connection. Practitioners, often women, would use herbs, chants, and rituals to heal the sick, predict the future, or call upon spirits. However, as Christianity spread throughout Europe, these practices were increasingly viewed as heretical or even demonic. Paganism is an ancient and diverse spiritual tradition, and it predates the rise of monotheistic religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The term itself is derived from the Latin word paganus, meaning country dweller. Isn't that cute? It just means country dweller. And it was used by early Christians to describe those who clung to pre-Christian polytheistic beliefs and nature-based religions. So while paganism was once the dominant spiritual practice in much of the world, over time it became associated with fear, witchcraft, and evil, largely due to the influence of institutional religion, particularly Christianity, and the cultural shift that was occurring at the time towards monotheism. So what exactly is paganism? Well, paganism encompasses a broad range of belief systems, but most of these share common characteristics. Many pagan traditions involve the worship of multiple gods and goddesses, each representing various aspects of life, nature, and even the cosmos. Pagan rituals often revolve around seasonal cycles, natural phenomenons, fertility, and the harvest, with a deep reverence for the earth and its elements. Pagan cultures across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas developed rich mythologies to explain natural events, celebrate life, and maintain the balance between the human world and the divine. In ancient Europe, the Celts, Romans, Norse, and Greeks all practiced forms of paganism. The Druids in Celtic culture, for example, served as religious leaders who conducted sacred ceremonies, maintained oral histories, and served as spiritual guides. Similarly, the Norse worshipped gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya, who represented power, wisdom, and fertility. Paganism was the fabric of life, blending community, spirituality, and the natural world into an interconnected whole. But the fall of paganism in Europe is deeply tied to the rise of Christianity. By the time Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, pagan practices were increasingly marginalized. Early Christians viewed their faith as exclusive, or the, quote, one true religion, unquote, and sought to convert others by any means necessary. Paganism, in contrast, was seen as incompatible with the Christian belief in God. Pagan festivals like Samhain, which is the precursor to Halloween, and Yule, a precursor to Christmas, were absorbed and transformed into Christian holidays, but their original meanings were either suppressed or altered. The way I kind of look at it is Christianity just kind of picked and chose the aspects of paganism that it liked. I mean, if you think about lighting candles in a church and making wishes and praying, well, that's kind of part of pagan tradition. So as the power of the church expanded across Europe, so did its intolerance towards paganism. In many cases, pagan temples were destroyed, sacred groves were cut down, and pagan practices were forbidden. Pagan deities were demonized, and the worship of gods and goddesses was interpreted as devil worship, paving the way for a link between paganism and evil. By the Middle Ages, paganism and its practices were often conflated with witchcraft. In part, this was due to the survival of folk traditions that persisted despite the dominance of Christianity. These traditions, which included herbal remedies, divination, and seasonal celebrations, were often labeled as witchcraft by the church. The term witch began to be used to describe people, especially women, who participated in these ancient arts, whether they identified as pagan or not. This fear of witchcraft grew out of several cultural and theological factors. First, Christian authorities began to teach that the devil was an active and real presence in the world, and it was constantly working to subvert Christian society. So anyone who engaged in practices outside the church's authority, especially if it involved elements of paganism, they were all viewed as potential agents of the devil. The herbs, charms, and potions that people used for healing, for instance, was labeled as witchcraft and sorcery. They believed that these activities were meant to invoke demonic forces. So this fear was exacerbated by the church's emphasis on dualism, the strict division between good, represented by God, and evil, represented by Satan. So in this worldview, anything outside the realm of Christianity could be seen and defined as satanic. And so ancient pagan rituals became recast as acts of heresy and devil worship. And it was women who were often targeted because, we liked to tend gardens and were natural nurturers, so we might make up a cocktail to help heal one of our family members. I mean, the roles of their communities back then was healers and midwives, so they had knowledge of herbalism and the natural world, which was oftentimes feared and misunderstood by authorities. So between the 15th and 18th centuries, Europe was engulfed in a series of witch hunts. During this period, tens of thousands of people, predominantly women, were executed for allegedly practicing witchcraft. The witch hunts were often fueled by a combination of fear, superstition, and the need for scapegoats during times of crisis. So if there were crop failures, plagues, and other natural disasters, those were frequently blamed on witchcraft. And those practicing pagan traditions were very easy targets. The connection between paganism and witchcraft was cemented in popular imagination, with pagan practices now viewed as actively malicious and dangerous. The church also used these witch hunts as tools for consolidating power. By targeting those who practiced folk traditions and pagan rituals, the church was able to suppress alternative forms of spirituality that posed a threat to its authority. Paganism was once a vibrant and diverse spiritual tradition, but it became synonymous with darkness and evil in this new Christian worldview. So these witch hunts were characterized by widespread hysteria, mass trials, and brutal executions. Tens of thousands of people were accused of practicing witchcraft, leading to torturous interrogations and public executions. These hunts were deeply entwined with political, religious, and even social upheavals, and were fueled by fear, superstition, and the rise of Christianity's dominance. So let's jump into some of these major witch trials, because when I first dove into researching this topic, I thought I was just going to be covering Salem Witch Trials, but the first recorded witch hunt actually dates back to the 1400s, 1428 to be exact. This happened in Valais, Switzerland. There were 300 or more executed, and it's one of the earliest and most devastating witch hunts. The Valais trials set a precedence for the later mass persecutions in Europe. So these trials began when locals, gripped by fear of witches causing illness and crop failures, accused several villagers of witchcraft. The fear spread, and over 300, mostly women, were tortured and executed, often buried alive. So this series of trials is considered to be the first major European witch hunt. But over 100 years later, in Germany, 368 people were executed in the Trier witch trials. This is one of the largest witch trials in history, and they were presided over by Bishop Peter Binsfeld, an avid witch hunter. These trials were partly motivated by crop failures and economic hardships. The authorities again used torture to extract confessions from those accused of summoning demons or causing harm via harmful magic. Even high-ranking officials, including judges and priests, were not immune from suspicion, and many were burned at the stake. Binsfeld's role in the trials was pivotal, and his writings, especially his book De Confessionibus Maleficorum et Sagarum, laid out guidelines for identifying witches and how to prosecute them. So about 50 years later, in 1628, we are still here in Germany. These became known as the Würzburg and Bamberg witch trials. 900 plus people were executed in Germany, so this was a hotbed of witch hysteria. And nowhere was this more evident than in these particular witch trials. The Würzburg trials, led by Prince Bishop Julius Exter von Mespelbrunn, wow, that's a name, targeted all levels of society, including children. Entire families were wiped out in the hunt for witches, with some trials claiming up to 40 victims in a single day. And similarly, the Bamberg witch trials, presided over by Prince Bishop Johann George II Fuchs von Dornheim. I mean, man, I'm crushing these names. Gotta hand it to myself. I'm giving myself a pat on the back. But his trials became notorious for their brutality and efficiency. These trials saw over 600 executions, and they involved the use of the infamous Drudenhaus, a torture chamber built specifically to interrogate suspected witches. So now we're going to travel north up to Scotland. The year is 1590, and we are in North Berwick. So King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, accused 70 plus witches in these trials. And they were sparked from a series of events, including a storm. Yeah, a storm that struck King James VI's ship as he returned to Scotland from Denmark. So it's not just like weather happening, it's witchcraft, and it's intentional, and the clouds can be controlled. I keep hearing about some people now thinking that humans can control the weather, and I'm like, are we back in the 1500s? Anyways, I digress. The king was convinced that witches had caused the storm to kill him. I mean, listen, guy, not everything's about you. And this led to a witch hunt that implicated over 70 people. Very notably, Agnes Sampson, a healer and midwife, was accused of summoning the storm through witchcraft. She was tortured extensively, and after confessing under duress, she was executed. These trials were fueled by King James's personal obsession with witchcraft, which he later wrote about in his treatise De Monologi. Now we're going to just pop on down to England. We are in Lancashire for the Pendle Witch Trials. 12 people were accused and 10 people were executed in the Pendle Witch Trials of 1612. And they're some of the most famous in English history. 12 individuals from two families, the Demdikes and the Chattoxes, were accused of witchcraft. The accusations began when Alison Device, a young woman, was accused of cursing a peddler who subsequently fell ill. This led to the arrest of her entire family and the eventual rounding up of several more suspects, including elderly Elizabeth Southerns, also known as Old Demdike, who was said to have had a long history of practicing witchcraft. The accused were tried at Lancaster Assizes, and the 10 were found guilty and hanged. The trials were notable for how quickly suspicion spread through the region, and it implicated entire families. So now we're back in Sweden, and it is 1675. 71 people were executed in the Torsaker witch trials, and they're among the deadliest in Swedish history. In this small village, 71 people, 65 being women and 6 being men, were beheaded in a single day. The mass hysteria that led to these executions was fueled by the testimony of children who claimed they had been abducted by witches and taken to the mythical land of Blackula to meet the devil. The accusations led to widespread panic, with local authorities carrying out brutal and swift punishment. I mean, they were terrified that children were being targeted by witches. So, how did this all come to be? I mean, it's fascinating to look back and think that there were people whose jobs it was to be a witch hunter. Imagine pulling up to like your wife's work and they're like, "What do you do for work?" And you're like, "I'm a witch hunter." Be like, "Whoa, that's real?" But I mean, these people invoked fear. They were intimidating. So I want to go over the role of these witch hunters and their persecution manuals. Heinrich Kramer, who wrote the 1487 book Malleus Maleficarum, he became instrumental in the spread of witch hunts across Europe. Heinrich Kramer was a Dominican friar, and he was one of the most influential figures in the witch hunts because he wrote Malleus Maleficarum, often referred to as the Witch Hunter's Bible. The Malleus provided detailed guidelines on how to identify, interrogate, and punish witches. It portrayed women as particularly susceptible to the devil's influence, leading to the widespread belief that most witches were female. Kramer's work was supported by the Pope of the time, and he actually wrote an order that gave church authorities the power to prosecute witchcraft as heresy. The Malleus was used extensively across Europe and became the blueprint for the violent and unjust witch hunts that followed. But about 200 years later, we have Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witch Finder General. Wow. Gosh, the egos these men must have had. This guy was responsible for over 100 executions. Now, Hopkins styled himself as the Witch Finder General during one of the most notorious witch hunting periods in England. Active during the English Civil War, Hopkins exploited local fears and political instability to conduct a series of witch hunts across East Anglia. He traveled from town to town, accusing women of witchcraft, often using very dubious methods such as the swimming test, where accused witches were thrown into water to see if they would float, as floating was believed to be a sign of witchcraft. So if they floated, they were witches and they would be hanged or otherwise brutalized. But if they drowned, they would also die. So either way, they're dying. Hopkins, I don't know the logic there, bro. His methods were brutal, and he executed over 100 women in just a few years. So he's considered to be one of the most prolific witch hunters in English history. Ew. So we've talked a little bit about Christianity, but now I want to talk about the role of Catholic and Protestant churches in the witch hunt. The Catholic Church played a significant role in stoking fears of witchcraft. especially during the Counter-Reformation. Witch hunts often coincided with periods of religious strife between Catholics and Protestants. In many regions, accusations of witchcraft were tied to religious conflicts because both sides used witch hunts as a way to target individuals who were seen as disloyal. Protestant Reformation also contributed to witch hysteria. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, while opposed to certain Catholic practices, believed in the literal existence of witches and the devil's influence in the world. In fact, many Protestant territories, such as Scotland and parts of Germany, witnessed some of the most intense witch hunts. But by the late 17th and 18th centuries, the witch hunts began to decline in Europe. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and science, thank the Lord, played a key role in curbing the spread of witch hunts. Additionally, legal reforms, such as stricter standards of evidence being required and the decline of torture as an interrogation method, contributed to the end of these persecutions. The European witch hunts left a lasting scar on the continent, though, with estimates suggesting that between 40 and 60,000 people were executed during this period. Today, the legacy of these hunts is a stark reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, religious fanaticism, and the consequences of unchecked authority. So now we're going to travel to early America. It's the 17th century, and we are going to go to the Puritan community of Salem. So in the late 1600s, as European settlers established colonies in the New World, they brought with them not only their customs and beliefs, but also their fear of witchcraft. Puritan communities in New England were particularly vulnerable to witch hunt hysteria. These were deeply religious societies built on a very strict interpretation of Christianity, and they believed that the devil was constantly at work, trying to tempt the good Christians away from the path of righteousness. Puritans saw the world in stark terms: good versus evil, God versus the devil. Anything that deviated from their beliefs was seen as a threat to their religious order. In this environment, the idea of witches consorting with the devil became terrifyingly real. To Puritans, the concept of magic, especially magic practiced by women, was a direct threat to their social order. Women in particular were seen as more susceptible to the devil's temptations. The idea that someone could use magic to manipulate the natural world or harm others played into the Puritan fears of losing control over their tightly ordered communities. And it's also deeply rooted in patriarchal structures and sexism, in my opinion. Because if you believe that the only power a woman can have is actually in magic that they've derived from the devil and not just because they're smart and capable women, then it's really easy to constantly keep women a step down, a step below you, because you're then instilling fear into one demographic so that you can lift yourself and the other men around you above them. It was very much a means of control and maintaining that patriarchal social structure. And magic, to the Puritans, represented rebellion against God's divine will. If someone could conjure spirits or cast spells, they were, in the Puritans' eyes, aligning themselves with the devil. So this belief system created a perfect storm for witch hunts to take hold in America, particularly in small, isolated communities like Salem. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 are perhaps the most infamous chapter in American history when it comes to witchcraft. But how did it all begin? The Salem Witch Trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. The trials resulted in the executions of 20 people, most of them women, and this left a deep scar on American history. To fully understand why the trials occurred, it's essential to look at the religious, social, and political context that preceded them. The Puritans were a very strict religious group from England, and they sought to create a new Jerusalem in American colonies. They wanted a place where they could freely practice their form of Christianity without persecution. So they initially settled in Boston in 1630. But over time, as the colony grew and became much more cosmopolitan, they began to fear that their strict religious values were being compromised by new settlers with more liberal, for the time, religious views. In the 1680s and 1690s, tensions were high in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There were potential conflicts with England, economic instability, and frequent skirmishes with Native Americans. Additionally, there was a religious divide between the conservative Puritans who had founded the colony and a growing number of colonists who favored more moderate religious practices. Many Puritans saw this as evidence that the devil was working in their midst, creating fertile ground for the witchcraft hysteria. So they fled to Salem. Salem is a small village on the edge of the Massachusetts wilderness, and it was particularly vulnerable to this paranoia. In contrast to nearby Salem town, which was wealthier and more progressive, Salem village was poorer and more isolated, and more devoutly Puritan. Tensions between these two communities further deepened the religious and social divide. So in 1692, when a group of young girls in Salem Village, including Betty Parris, who was the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, and Abigail Williams, her cousin, began exhibiting strange behaviors. They would scream, convulse, and speak in tongues, claiming that invisible forces were pinching and biting them. Doctors were unable to find a medical explanation, so this suggested that the girls might be under the influence of witchcraft. And the fear spread very quickly through the village, as more and more girls seemed to show similar symptoms. So under pressure from their elders, the girls accused 3 women of being witches. Tituba, a Caribbean slave owned by Reverend Parris, Sarah Good, a poor and homeless woman, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had a contentious reputation in the village. Tituba was the first to confess to practicing witchcraft, possibly under duress or torture. She told elaborate stories of how the devil had approached her and others in the village, offering them supernatural powers. And this confession fueled the hysteria as it confirmed the community's worst fears. Witches were among them, consorting with the devil to harm innocent people. Her confession also provided the authorities with a narrative of a growing conspiracy of witches, so then this led to further accusations. Sarah Good was a poor woman who was begging from her neighbors, and she was just another easy target. Her social status made her vulnerable to accusations, as she was often seen as an outsider in the village. Good vehemently denied the charges against her, but her defiant attitude and the fact that she had a reputation for cursing people made her a likely scapegoat. Now, Sarah Osborne was an elderly and sickly woman who had a history of legal disputes over property, and this made her quite unpopular. Osborne had also stopped attending church regularly due to her illness, so this, for whatever reason, made her suspect in the deeply religious community. She denied the charges, but was imprisoned nonetheless. So after these initial accusations, the witch hunt just spiraled out of control. As fear spread, more people were accused of witchcraft. The accusations often stemmed from personal grudges to local disputes or mere suspicion. The primary accusers were the same young girls who had first shown symptoms, but then others soon joined in, claiming that they had been bewitched or seen spirits. Rebecca Nurse was a well-respected elderly woman, but she was accused of witchcraft despite her reputation for piety and kindness. Her trial shocked the community, as many viewed her as an unlikely candidate for witchcraft. Nevertheless, she was convicted and hanged in July of 1692. Martha Corey is another victim. She was the wife of a prominent farmer and was accused largely because she had skepticism about the legitimacy of the trials. So she was, questioning authority. I guess she's a witch. Her husband, Giles Corey, was also accused and famously pressed to death with heavy stones after refusing to enter a plea. Now, we've all probably heard this name, John Proctor. John Proctor was a wealthy and outspoken farmer, and he was one of the few men accused during the trials. Proctor criticized the witch trials and the girls' behavior, so this obviously made him a target. He was convicted and hanged, and though his wife Elizabeth Proctor, who was also accused, she ended up being spared due to her pregnancy. The Salem Witch Trials are very controversial even to this day because they were marked by a lack of due process and they relied on dubious evidence, if you can even call it that. The trials took place before the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a special court established by Governor William Phips to hear the cases. The court relied heavily on something called spectral evidence. So this is testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had been seen committing witchcraft. So not necessarily them physically, but their spirit body appeared and they were committing the crime. So this meant that any alibi was totally unrecognized because these people could be accused even if they were somewhere else at the time because it was their spirit bodies coming to do it. Spectral evidence was also difficult to refute because it was based on accusers' visions and dreams. And in addition to spectral evidence, the accused were often subjected to various forms of tests to determine their guilt, one of which was called the touch test. Accused witches were brought into physical contact with their victims. If the victim's symptoms stopped when they were touched by the accused, it was taken as proof of witchcraft. Yeah, sounds like really foolproof. There was also a search for witch marks. Authorities would search the bodies of the accused for physical signs of a witch mark, such as a mole or a blemish, and that was believed to be where the devil had suckled. So if you got moles, you're a witch. And of course, the infamous swimming tests, where the accused would be thrown into water and either float or sink to their death. So these legal proceedings were chaotic and very unbalanced. The accused had few legal protections, and even those who maintained their innocence were often convicted based on little more than hearsay and hysteria. In total, 20 people were executed during the Salem Witch Trials. 19 were hung, and Giles Corey was pressed. The vast majority of those executed were women, but several men who just wanted to support and speak up for their wives were also hanged. The full list includes Bridget Bishop. She was the first person to be executed. She was an outspoken woman, and she ran a tavern. So since she was, around alcohol and maybe a little of a late night owl, she became a target. We also have Rebecca Nurse, and her conviction shocked many people. We have Sarah Good and a man named George Burroughs. He was actually a former minister, and he was accused of being the ringleader of the witches. We also have Martha Carrier. Now, she had a contentious reputation in the village, and she was accused of causing a smallpox outbreak through witchcraft at the time of her accusation. But by the end of the trials, over 200 people had been accused of witchcraft, and even more were imprisoned. This mass hysteria only began to subside when prominent ministers like Increase Mather and Cotton Mather began to speak out against the use of spectral evidence, arguing that it was unreliable. Finally someone spoke up. By October of 1692, Governor William Phips, under an increasing pressure from the public and religious leaders, dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer and replaced it with a new court that disallowed spectral evidence. This decision effectively ended the trials. In 1693, Phips issued a proclamation officially pardoning those who had been convicted. And it's just heartbreaking that these innocent people were killed in such brutal ways for, doing literally nothing? Because some children had come up with a story to get attention. It's really just heartbreaking. The Salem Witch Trials left a lasting scar on American history, but the impact goes far beyond the events of 1692. In many ways, the witch trials serve as a warning about the dangers of scapegoating and abuses of power. And even today, their legacy continues to inform discussions about justice, due process, and the consequences of fear-driven societies. The phrase witch hunt has also become part of our political vocabulary at this point, used to describe situations where innocent people are targeted without evidence. The Salem Witch Trials have been referenced in everything from Arthur Miller's famous play The Crucible to modern-day political rhetoric. And the trials remind us of the importance of critical thinking, tolerance, and protecting the rights of the accused. The fear of witchcraft, however, did not end with the Salem Witch Trials of 1692, and it has continued to shape societal attitudes towards paganism and witchcraft long after. Throughout history, the tension between Christianity and any practice associated with magic has remained palpable, largely due to theological differences, social fear, and misunderstandings about the nature of witchcraft and pagan traditions like Wicca. In the 20th century, the emergence of Wicca, one of the most prominent forms of modern-day paganism, brought witchcraft back into public discourse. Wicca was introduced in the 1940s and 50s by Gerald Gardner, a retired British civil servant who had claimed to have been initiated into a surviving coven of witches. Gardner's teachings combined elements of pre-Christian paganism, ceremonial magic, and Western esotericism, and he framed Wicca as a peaceful, nature-centered religion focused on the worship of God and the goddess, and the practice of ritual magic, but also a deep respect for the earth and its cycles. Wiccans and other modern witches emphasize a harmonious relationship with nature, celebrating the changing seasons through rituals and festivals. Many Wiccans believe in the divine as both masculine and feminine, often personified as the horned god and the triple goddess. The goddess represents the cycles of birth, growth, death, and rebirth, and is often associated with the moon, while the god is linked to nature, the sun, and wild animals. Wicca also has a strong ethical component, encapsulated in the Wiccan read, "And it harm none, do what ye will." This guiding principle encourages practitioners to act in a way that avoids harm to others, reflecting Wicca's focus on peace, balance, and positive energy. The law of threefold return, another important Wiccan belief, suggests that any action a person takes, whether good or bad, will return to them threefold. Despite this peaceful and earth-centered belief, Wiccans have often faced stigma and misunderstanding, particularly from mainstream Christian society. The association of witchcraft with evil and the devil, deeply ingrained in the Western imagination, continued to influence perception of Wiccans, who, although practicing a modern form of paganism, were often still viewed as dangerous or heretical. While Wicca and other forms of modern paganism have gained popularity and visibility in recent decades, they still face opposition, particularly from conservative Christian groups. For many Christians, the belief in witchcraft as a malevolent force remains deeply rooted in biblical teachings and centuries of church doctrine. These Christians view magic as a form of spiritual deception, often linked to Satan or demonic forces, and this echoes the fears of the Puritans during the Salem Witch Trials. How ironic. So this ongoing stigma is evident in how Wiccans and witches are portrayed in popular culture, where they are frequently depicted as sinister or dangerous figures. But, they're almost always very attractive, so they've got that. There are so many books and movies and TV shows that perpetuate these stereotypes, so this can reinforce the idea that witchcraft is associated with malevolent forces. But I'd have to say that most of the media I consume follows a good witch who is fighting against evil forces. So I just think that take is really interesting. The thing is, most modern practitioners of Wicca and witchcraft focus on healing or protection and spiritual growth. What about modern-day accusations of witchcraft? In many parts of the world, accusations of witchcraft continue to result in persecution, particularly in rural and deeply religious societies. In places like sub-Saharan Africa, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Southeast Asia, belief in witchcraft is still widespread, and individuals, often women or even children, may be accused of practicing harmful magic. These accusations can lead to violent punishment, ostracization, and even death. Even in more developed countries, Wiccans and pagans may face social stigma or discrimination due to their beliefs. In the United States, for example, Wiccans have fought for the right to have their religious symbols, such as the pentacle, recognized by the government. and there are still communities where openly practicing witchcraft can lead to harassment or exclusion. However, in many Western countries, there's been a growing acceptance and curiosity towards Wicca and other pagan practices, particularly due to the environmental movement and the rise of interest in alternative spirituality. Many people are drawn to Wicca's emphasis on the sacredness of nature, personal empowerment, and the exploration of mystical traditions that were once oppressed. At its core, Wicca is a spiritual path that embraces the divine in nature, promotes harmony in the earth, and encourages personal responsibility in spiritual practice. Though there's no central authority or dogma in Wicca, several key beliefs are common across many Wiccan traditions. The first is the divine as dual. Wiccans believe in a dual divine presence, often represented as the goddess and the god. We talked a little bit about it before. The goddess is kind of a symbolism of the feminine energy, the moon, and the god is more of that masculine energy, like the sun. They also view nature as sacred, with many of their rituals revolving around the cycles of the earth, the phases of the moon, and tuning into the seasons. Wiccans celebrate 8 Sabbats or seasonal festivals, and these honor the changing cycles of life and death. There's also the Wiccan Rede, which we briefly touched on. Quote, "And it harm none, do what ye will." Basically saying, if you do no harm, then do whatever you want. This encourages Wiccans to live responsibly, and it ensures that their actions don't cause harm to others. Wiccans believe in personal freedom and responsibility, both in life and spiritual practice. And of course, we have the law of threefold return. Think of it as whenever you point a finger, you have 3 more pointed back at you. This idea encourages ethical behavior and mindfulness both in magical and mundane actions. So whether it's positive or negative, anything you do to somebody else will be returned threefold. Wiccans also use ritual magic as a means of connecting with the divine and bringing about personal or communal change. Rituals often involve specific tools like a ceremonial dagger, a wand, a chalice, candles, all of this to focus energy and intention. Magic in Wicca isn't seen as supernatural, but rather as a natural force that can be harnessed through will, focus, and alignment with the cycles of nature. Many Wiccans also believe in some form of reincarnation or afterlife, but specific beliefs do vary. Some Wiccans believe in a place called the Summerland, where souls rest and reflect before being reincarnated. Others see reincarnation as a cycle of learning and growth, where the soul experiences multiple lifetimes to achieve spiritual evolution. In the 21st century, the practice of witchcraft, especially in the context of Wicca, represents a reclaiming of spiritual traditions that were once suppressed by dominant religious institutions. For many, Wicca provides a meaningful way to connect with nature, the divine feminine, and a sense of personal empowerment. Despite the lingering stigma and opposition from some Christian groups, modern witches and Wiccans continue to challenge historical misconceptions, showing that witchcraft is not about malevolent forces, but about harmony, balance, and the celebration of life's natural cycles. The divide between Christianity and witchcraft may persist, but for many Wiccans, their practice is peaceful, a life-affirming, and a spiritual path that honors the earth and the sacred within. So where are we today when it comes to witch hunts? Well, all of these witch hunts, whether in Europe or America or anywhere else in the world, were fueled by fear. In the case of the Salem Witch Trials, it was a combination of rigid Puritan society, political instability, and social tensions that led to the tragedy. And today, while witchcraft is no longer feared in the same way, the spiritual divide between spiritual practices like Wicca and traditional Christianity still exists. The legacy of the witch trials continues to teach us valuable lessons, particularly about, in my opinion, the patriarchy and how women seem to be the scapegoat for what's unexplainable in life. The very people that tried to heal someone of their sickness might be blamed for causing it. But as society becomes more open to diverse spiritual practices, it's essential to remember the past and ensure that such fear-driven violence never happens again. These are chapters in history that we just can't forget. They remind us of what happens when fear outweighs reason, when communities turn on each other in search of easy answers, and when we fail to protect the most vulnerable people. But it also reminds us of the power of resilience, the need for justice, and the importance of religious tolerance in a world that continues to evolve. So what do you think, guys? I don't know, after this video, being Wiccan sounds right up my alley. But like I said, I just want to be a witch. I want to have magic. I think it would be so cool to be able to just like cast spells, but I am still such a child at heart. Like, I used to pretend that I was getting my acceptance letter to Hogwarts, and I just love the idea of magic. I love it. And maybe magic is all around us. Maybe in certain ways it is real. What do you guys think? What conclusions have you come to? And where are you at on your spiritual journey? Were you once very, very conservative Christian and now you've opened up more to, occult practices or Wiccan practices or more of a spiritual ideology? I know for me, I came from a Christian upbringing and now I just consider myself more spiritual without any real definitive practice or belief. So I'm really curious what you guys think and if you liked this deep dive. I'm sure there are so many of you that have even more facts and tidbits that I couldn't get to, so please share them in the comments down below. But with all that said, thank y'all so much for joining me today. Leave a little witch emoji if you watched to the end of the video, and thank you guys so much for your support. Stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. Until my next video, bye.